Hey everybody, welcome to OiC and welcome to my living room. My name is Maicon Steuernagel. I'm the pastor at OiC International Church, and today I get a bonus reflection. The plan was actually starting our new semester theme at our service at Bakkehaunkirke, but we had some logistical challenges and unfortunately we can't have our service there today. I won't bore you with the details, but as a result, some of us are meeting in our homes, others are tuning in on this video on their own or on the go, and I got a bonus video to make with no predefined theme, which is exciting, right? Well, not for me because I have to come up with something, so I spent a lot of time thinking, what can I talk about that makes sense in between what we've been talking about and what we will talk about next. I had all the poetry of the Psalms still echoing in my mind and in my heart, and I had the things we are going to go into from next week. It's the third time, by the way, that I mentioned our new semester theme, and I still haven't told you what it is. I hope you're getting curious. And I also had the news, right? The times we're living in. 2020. 2020 is one of those years that will end up in history books. Hopefully will end up in history books, because being in a history book means that history managed to carry on beyond these traumatic events. But 2020 is a paradigm shifting year, right? And in many senses, it seems like the world as we know it is no more. And we're not quite sure of what the near future is going to look like. And we're really not sure what the long-term future is going to look like. We have hopes, but there's this uncertainty in the air. And it's not everything, it's not that everything is about 2020 itself, of course, but the pandemic has kind of shaken us out of our routines and forced us to reflect on much more than just the pandemic itself. So the political landscape is changing, the environmental landscape is changing, the virtual landscape has changed seemingly overnight when the workplace and 90% of our personal relations just suddenly moved online with force. Ask Zoom, at least they're happy about 2020 even if all the rest of us hate it. With all these thoughts sort of buzzing wildly in my head, I suddenly met the disciples of Jesus in a similar kind of situation, facing the prospect of paradigm shifting events, perhaps even cataclysmic events. And I found them like that in a conversation with Jesus. And for us modern readers, it may seem like it comes out of the blue and involves some serious kind of overreacting from both the disciples and Jesus, but I'll tell you in a minute why that's not the case. And this is how the conversation begins. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. "Do you see all these things?" he asked. "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down." As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. "Tell us," they said, "when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" This is the beginning of chapter 24 of Matthew. So Jesus had been teaching at the temple in Jerusalem, and he's on his way out with his disciples. And the disciples, like good Galilean tourists and devout Jews, they look at a temple and they go something like, "Hey Jesus, isn't this beautiful? Look at that temple. Does it look like nice from this angle? Look at the sun setting behind it." You know, no filter on Instagram. They're admiring it. And Jesus, total mood killer, goes, "Yeah, that's all coming down. That's all turning into rubble." And next thing you know, the disciples are asking Jesus about the end of the age, right? About the end of times, basically. So how on earth did they get from A to B? How did they get from the destruction of the temple to the end of the world? Seems a bit overdramatic, right? Well, if for us it may seem like a stretch or kind of an absurd overreaction of some kind, for a Jew, this actually made a lot of sense. If you read through the Jewish scriptures, which Christians tend to call the Old Testament, you will see that the temple was in many ways a kind of indicator of how bad or good things were in the history of Israel. A kind of a thermometer for the religious and political health and temperature of the nation. We don't have time to go into all of that, but just to give you a brief idea. Not long after the Israelites are delivered from their slavery in Egypt, they build a tabernacle, which was essentially a portable version of the temple that would later come. The tabernacle was the ultimate symbol for them of God's presence with his people as they wandered in the desert and were in their pilgrimage to the promised land. And when they finally take hold of Canaan and conquer it, and get some level of stability in the land under King David and King Solomon, they get to finally build the temple. And this was it, right? This was the goal. They had the temple, they had the king, they had the land, they were safe, right? But it doesn't take long for things to go bad again. And over the course of the next centuries, the temple gets looted, desecrated, destroyed, reconstructed, expanded, commercialized, and each of these occurrences to the temple, they mirror the state of affairs in Israel. Corrupt and idolatrous kings, unholy alliances with foreign powers, invasions and dominion by foreign powers, and of course the deepest scar in their history up to that point, exile. So when Jesus says of the temple that not one stone will be left on another, it's really no surprise that the disciples take this to mean that an extremely dramatic turn of events is around the corner. This is about much more than the temple. The reaction is our normal reaction to that kind of prediction. When will this happen? How can we prepare? How will we know that the things are going to get that bad, and what should we do? The perspective of the destruction of the temple means that the world as they knew it would be dramatically upended. Sounds familiar? Matthew dedicates the rest of chapter 24 and the whole of chapter 25 to Jesus' response, not only to their question, but to their feelings, their fears, and their expectations. We unfortunately don't have the time to go into the detail of all of it, but I want to point out a few important elements of Jesus' response. And the first thing that Jesus does is, in response to their question for timing and for signs, the first thing he does is that he launches on a quite grim depiction of what lies ahead. He speaks of deceitful messiahs, wars, famines and earthquakes, of betrayals, false prophets, and increased wickedness. He speaks of times so dreadful that pregnant women and nursing mothers will despair of being carrying child. And it all seems terrible, but it also seems somewhat loose and in a way difficult to pinpoint, because all that stuff, as horrible as they are, they're also not exactly breaking news. Wars, famines, natural disasters, abusive religious leaders, and wicked people, that's pretty much the stuff of history, right? And the disciples themselves, they knew that kind of reality quite well. They were first century Galileans from the outskirts of a land under the dominion of the Roman Empire. But what perhaps was news for them was that Jesus warned them that they would now also be persecuted and made to suffer for his name, for being followers of Christ. But even that, from our perspective, who knows what comes next, that didn't take more than a few decades to become, in a way, normalized. In the sense that it became so common that though it was and still is something terrible to experience, it could hardly be designed to indicate a particularly evil time. From that time, Christians have experienced persecution. So to put it differently, it quickly became a part of the game of evil in this world. So it's quite natural then to want to know not only what, but when. When is the real deal? And here's a central part to how Jesus addresses that question. But about that day or hour, no one knows. Not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. That is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill, one will be taken and the other left. Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at a proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time, and he then begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Okay, let's face it. That last verse looks like a script for a Tarantino movie, and the hyperbolic language, it makes the hairs of our modern sensibilities stand on end. But the reason that I chose this specific part to read with you today is that it shows Jesus at the same time saying that the hour is unknown, and so he's not giving a specific when, but he's still addressing the issue of time. Instead of a then, he gives us a developing when to deal with. And he does this by recalling a formative story of Israel's ancient identity, their past, and then addressing the forward thrust of history through a series of parables. The look backwards comes with the story of Noah. The disciples would have known that story inside out, so they knew that as the story goes, there's this massive flood that comes because of the exceeding wickedness of mankind, to start things anew. But that is not what Jesus focuses on. He is addressing the issue of time, and his point is that nobody knew what would hit them and when until it was over them. And then there's more, and Jesus didn't really mention this, but the disciples would have known it didn't really work. For all they knew, the world was as wicked during their lifetime as it had been before Noah. So what's the point with telling that story? And a story that makes us look back when we're asking about what's ahead? And I guess we're just going to have to let that hanging for a bit and see what Jesus does next. And what he does next is to thrust us into a world of parables. Instead of giving them a date that they could mark in their calendars or some concrete sign to look out for, Jesus gives them stories, poetry, wordplay. He asks them to engage their imagination. The thing with parables, as with the poetry of the Psalms and with other forms of arts, is that it disarms us. They change the light in the room so that different colors call our attention, different shadows show different shapes. They cover our eyes so that we are forced to smell. They cover our ears so that our eyes can see. They prophetically subvert reality so that we may better understand it, better sense it. Jesus tells stories. A story of 10 young women who were invited for a wedding and fell asleep as they waited for the groom to arrive and the party to start. And his delay catches half of them off guard late in the night. With no oil to refill their lamps, they are left outside in the cold. Stories of a man who goes out on a journey and entrusts his servants with a veritable fortune for them to administer in his absence. And they do so, and they double what was entrusted them. All with the exception of one who hides it in fear of loss, in fear of punishment. And in doing that, he loses that which was supposed to be invested and not withheld. Stories of sheep who receive a kingdom for acts of kindness done to the lowest servants of the king. And of goats who are rejected by the king for having failed to show kindness to his suffering people. And as we listen to these stories, they do in fact tell us something about time. As we look through them, they tell us that the time is now. Whenever the then may be, it is at our door, and the time is now for that which really is asked of us: mercy, kindness, and love. Eyes open to what we have in our hands and those around us don't. Hearts open to care for that which is not ours, but which we have been entrusted with. Creation and all in it, especially everyone in it. The point with the parable of the servant who is put in charge of the household is not that he should have kept his eyes on the horizon so that he could see his masters coming as soon as he turned the bend on the road. No, the point is that he should have kept his eyes on those around him whom he had been entrusted with caring for. He is not punished for not having been waiting for his master at the door with the warm meal. He is punished because he refused the warm meal to his fellow servants. He beat them instead. He drank all the wine and didn't spare them a cup for some time at the end of the workday. Matthew brings us all these parables together in response to the disciples' fear of the future, and he does it in such a way that it gives us a perspective that takes the future seriously but avoids two common pitfalls. The first one is using the inevitability of the future as an excuse for inaction now. But when talking about the future, Jesus seems more concerned with what we are doing right now, especially with what we are doing to and for each other. The other pitfall is using the distance of the future as an excuse for inaction now. But Jesus tells us we don't know the hour. He shows us how the time of wickedness was in the past and is in the future, but is also now. The destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70 did not silence the voice of these parables and what they mean for us today. If we look at the scriptures and the textual evidence, we have good reason to believe that the early church thought that the end of the age and the parousia, the second coming of Jesus, was coming in their immediate near future. It didn't. And we can think that they were naive. Or we can consider that that perspective is a humbly realistic approach to time, because we simply don't know. We do not know more than they did. We don't know how much time there is ahead, or if God may just bend time on its head. What we do know is what we can do with the time we are in. What we do know is the bags of gold in our hands and the people around us. We don't know what 2021 will look like. We don't know what next month will look like. But we know that mercy, love, and kindness are on God's agenda this very day. So may the Lord bless us. May He keep us. May He make His face shine upon us and be gracious to us. May He turn His face towards us and give us peace, and make us agents of peace and mercy and grace. And so may we go in peace and serve the Lord and each other joyfully.